Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster, all the way down Whitehall and beyond. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello, we're recording on Wednesday the 12th of February, and crucial to this podcast is Kirsty Buchanan, who is Special Advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Oh, thank you for that intro. Yes, hello.
And also crucial to the podcast, Joe Tanner, political strategist, who's advised politicians from various political parties, including some with notoriously floppy blonde hair at various stages. Hello, Joe.
What an intro. Narrow down who had floppy blonde hair. I wonder who you can think of.
I'll let your imaginations run wild. On the podcast today, medical experts warn that amendments to the assisted dying bill could be a slippery slope. There's hundreds of changes floating around in the air to that bill. We'll have a little look at some of the headline grabbers. Plus, Labour suspending elected representatives because of offensive and inappropriate WhatsApp messages. Speaking of which, don't send any inappropriate ones, but you can WhatsApp us. The number is 0333 404 6507. Just start your message with the word Whitehall, and Pete has done just that. So shall we start with these considerations from Pete? Hello, Pete. He was catching up on the Growth podcast and the mention of Starmer, Keir Starmer, and his position on Heathrow and a third runway potentially changing over time. He said, I'm yet to get a handle of the real Kemi Badenoch, but I'd be interested to hear you discuss Sir Keir's political reality. I think he's a decent man who has principles, but those same principles can crumble under what is often really pretty limited pressure. Pete also says, welcome to the podcast, Joe. It's great to have a second contributor. And here, and so say all of us.
Oh, I don't know Pete, unless it's someone I know who is pretending to be a Pete. But thanks, Pete. I'll take that.
It is lovely to have you here. So should we just start, before we get into Kemi Badenoch and her leadership, which is going to be a kind of focal point of this episode, I thought it was worth considering Pete's point. This idea of Sir Keir Starmer's political reality. A man with principles, does he crumble too easily? And I think this might tee us up for a few discussions, actually, today, Kirsty. What would be your take on principles versus crumbling under pressure?
I half agree with Pete. I think he's a decent man. I think probably some of the problem is that he's slightly lacking in principles and more kind of overlaid with pragmatic managerial politics. I mean, I have probably said this ad nauseum on this pod. I think he's turning out to be a version of Rishi Sunak. He's quiet, he's decent, he's hardworking, but he approaches leadership in a kind of managerial role. He thinks that getting on with the business, if you like, is sufficient unto the day, and eventually the public will come to see that as delivery rolls out. I think the two problems with that are, one, the challenges of the delivery are extremely high. And not at all certain to be realised. And two, we live in a communications age, of which we will talk more in a minute about Kemi. And you need leaders who can communicate well. And for all Starmer's qualities, and he certainly has many of them. The ability to communicate well, to connect with people, to give people a sense that he shares their values, as opposed to being some, Northwest London kind of liberal elite, human rights lawyer with all his human rights lawyer chums, I think is lacking.
Yeah. Would you agree, Joe?
It struck me, actually, as you made that connection to Rishi, is do we suffer from having people that are, it's not even career politicians anymore, but it's sort of public servants who, feel that the role is about public service. And it's in contrast to Trump, who is a businessman first and, now president sort of second, he would say now first, but we know that his first love has been business. And there's a sort of, is there something about that character that goes into public service and has confines to work within? It's not often you talk about public servants that break out of the box and do something particularly innovative or clever or risky. It's you are sort of used to being a certain way. You conduct yourself in a certain way. It's probably a career that's attractive to a certain type of person. And I just wonder if there is something about that we have another person for whom public service, which don't get me, I don't say it as it's a fault. I think it's just a characteristic that people that generally are in public service, when they are, you can be Prime Minister and be bombastic. We've seen that before. It doesn't also always end well or start well or even the whole process go well. But I just wonder if it's a personality type that then ends up with a certain type of governance, because you are the sort of head of a machine, but you also see yourself as part of that machine. You'll see yourself within the confines of the machine rather than somebody that wants to change the machine, reform the machine, change it, do it differently.
Is the hypothetical here that Keir Starmer would be like a better permanent secretary of the civil service department or a kind of cabinet secretary or something? Is that the sort of person we're kind of picturing here when we think of Keir Starmer?
I do wonder if that is there is something in that, because it's that thinking out of the box that particularly good communicators have, because good communicators are often suddenly caught on a sticky wicket and have to figure out, you either know you're losing the room and you have to sort of modify your speech or your tone, or you have to give a witty answer, or you rewrite the speech that's given to you in the first place because it won't do anything, it won't do enough. But there are some people that, they don't like lots of excitement. They don't like things to be very different day to day. They like things to be the way they like them. And I sort of think of the old Reggie Perrin, who sort of had the same routine every morning, and, people that sort of say the same hellos to people. And, it's not that when you meet Keir Starmer in person, he's very amiable, nice guy, funny, the same stuff we always said about Theresa May, same stuff probably said about Rishi Sunak, I think, after times I've met him. But it's that, are they ever going to surprise you? Are they going to do something that you're not expecting? And actually, it's all a bit beige.
It is extraordinary to me. We are a population of, 60 plus million. Yep. It must surely be possible in the massive talent pool that is Britain to find a politician that can manage to combine charm and kind of morality in a sense of public service. Does it have to be kind of one end of the extreme or the other? And so at one end, we've got, people with blonde floppy hair who have not one scintilla of kind of driving factor of public service about them, and it's all about ego and self and power for kind of power's sake. And on the other hand, we have these people who are just stubbornly resistant to some of the, realities, not just of government, but of communicating what government's all about. That was Sunak's primary problem, apart from the inheritance, obviously, which was no mean feat. And the same here. Is it no longer possible to find someone with integrity and charm?
If that is you, step up. Let's go.
Let's give Pete a go. Let's give Pete a go.
Your country needs you. Thank you, Pete. That was good. That was a nice thought provoker to start. If you'd like to WhatsApp us, you can. The number is 0333 404 6507. Just pop Whitehall on the start of it. Or you can email us hello@whitehallsources.com to get in touch. Right, Kemi Badenoch at Prime Minister's Questions today she's had a bit of a shocker, I think it's fair to say. There's almost unanimous criticism for how the Leader of the Opposition has handled Prime Minister's Questions today. In fact, something that is probably quite telling in this context is that her spokesman decided to miss the usual post-Prime Minister's Questions briefing. So what normally happens...
run away, if you like.
Well, some may say... what usually happens is once Prime Minister's Questions is finished, all the journalists go into a sort of back room up behind the press gallery, and the spokesperson for the Prime Minister will do a sort of huddle, get questions thrown at them. Spokesperson for the opposition will do the same. The opposition didn't show up today. I just want to read some of the analysis from commentator types on Twitter, on X, since PMQs. Dan Hodges at the Mail on Sunday. That wasn't just Kemi Badenoch's worst performance as leader. It was one of the worst performances ever from a leader of the opposition. She had no capacity to readjust after Starmer gave her a clear and direct answer on the Gaza family. It was embarrassing to watch. This is Ava Santina from Politics Joe. Striking how poorly researched Kemi Badenoch's PMQs are. The best line was about Labour's new borders watchdog that will apparently work from home in Finland, knocked back by Starmer explaining he was hired and worked from home since 2019 under the Tories. The lack of fact-checking is extraordinary. Baroness Hazarika, our friend, Aisha Hazarika. Fair to say Kemi Badenoch had a stinker at PMQs today. Clearly not able to listen in the moment and think on her feet. Backbench morale will be low. I'll finish with this one from Christopher Hope, the political editor of GB News. I call that PMQs a 6-0 to Sir Keir Starmer. Kemi Badenoch didn't have a plan B for her 6 questions when the PM said he would close a loophole to allow Gazans to settle in the UK under the Ukrainian resettlement scheme. And just to sort of put it all into context, here's 40 seconds of Sir Keir Starmer really landing the point that Kemi Badenoch wasn't dealing with his answers particularly well.
We need to put our national interests before the ECHR. Does he agree that we should legislate even if lawyers warn that this might be incompatible with human rights law?
I believe she complains about scripted answers and questions. Her script doesn't allow her to listen to the answer. Prime Minister. She asked me if we're going to change the law and close the loophole in question 1. I said yes. She asked me again in question 2, and I said yes. She asked me again in question 3. It's still yes.
Kirsty, this sort of brings us round to this idea of how Kemi Badenoch is dealing with being leader of the opposition. PMQs today, not her finest hour. You've actually spent quite a lot of time listening to Kemi Badenoch for the podcast over the last couple of days.
I have. Devoted podcast host am I. I have spent hours, in fact, listening to Kemi Badenoch over the last, and it's been a journey, let me tell you. And the reason that I've had the ability to listen to her for hours is because obviously this week was the anniversary 100 days of Kemi being leader of the opposition, which obviously has this inevitable kind of media flurry of how's she doing. And so she pulled a kind of Trumpian playbook point and put herself on 2 podcasts, which are, broadly speaking, I think it's fair to say, centre-right podcasts. Perfectly sensible. One of them has more than 1 million subscribers to it. I wish that was ours, but you know,
we're not far off.
We're a work in progress.
We've got Pete.
Yeah.
They haven't got Pete.
Big up to Pete.
Stay here, Pete.
Yeah, and it's definitely the right kind of format for her. It's a sort of, and I get the feeling and the sentiment behind it. It's a bit of a, Trump turning up for, Joe Rogan and kind of preaching to the choir. And what I heard her say makes a lot of sense, right? When you've got a kind of long format to explain her leadership strategy, it makes a lot of sense. And it is kind of encapsulated in this thought that she says, stop making promises. Politicians for too long, for decades, make promises that don't have a plan underneath it. Stop making promises without a plan. That's called an announcement. And so what she's doing with this kind of, the strategy is, one, obviously to own the mistakes of the past and have a certain amount of humility about them. There's no hiding from the disaster that was the last few years of Conservative rule and that endless psychodrama. So you've got to hold that. 2, start to re-engineer and make sure that you've got a plan. And one of her criticisms, quite rightly, I think, of Labour, and I think I've said this before, they've got 3 milestones, 5 missions, 3 foundations. Let's get it right. So complicated. 3 foundations, 5 missions, 6 milestones, and no plan. And that's one of the reasons you see Labour being buffeted around. So she's saying, look, before we start to tell you about our policies, we need to make sure that they are robust and that they can be delivered and that we have a plan that sits underneath them. Otherwise, you get stuff like Brexit, without a plan for how to deliver it. You get stuff like a legal commitment for net zero without a real understanding of how you're going to get there. And so I understand the argument for it. And she's saying, give me this time. I am an engineer by kind of profession. This is what I want to do. I want to get under the bonnet of it and make sure that we have the right plans, and then we'll come forward with policy. Perfectly rational argument. She also says, and a perfectly broad criticism, that she wants to be, to offer the public, again, authentic conservatism. So, not, the rhetoric of the right and the reality of governing from the left, which is her criticism of previous government. So she wants an authentic party, a credible, authentic alternative. Give me time to deliver that. And so after those 2 podcasts, I thought, yeah, she's funny, she's determined, there's a perfect rationale for the argument, makes sense. And then we go and watch PMQs.
Yeah.
And like everybody else, I sat
Feel
and
that
watched
handbrake turn.
So I had this sort of warmth, and I even texted her, her press secretary, and said, "Oh, I've just listened to this hour on this other podcast, which I won't name." She came across really well. Bravo.
Yeah.
And then I watched PMQs, kind of behind my fingers a little bit. And this is the problem. If you're taking, I take the point about she works well in long form content, work well for Trump with Joe Rogan. We're not in an election cycle at the moment.
Yeah.
What we're in at the moment is a pressure on a leader to perform and to perform quickly. And her audience right now isn't the kind of, broadly speaking, isn't kind of conservative or centre-right voters thinking about whether to give the Conservatives another try. It's her own parliamentary party and it's the media. And frankly, above that, it's the donors at the party. Mm. And for them, probably 90% of them, their main interaction with her is at PMQs. Yeah. And what they voted for when they voted for Kemi was a fighter. She stood on stage and said, "I'm a fighter, by instinct, I'll fight for you." What they've got at the moment is engineer Kemi.
Right.
And so what you're seeing in PMQs, which I think is just entirely the wrong strategy, is these clever questions, which are very complicated, have a lot of kind of, parentheses in them. And for a lawyer like Starmer can back these away so easily. You just need a very simple kind of gotcha question that Starmer can't wriggle out of. The more parentheses, the more clauses, the more complicated a question to a lawyer, the easier he will skirt through it. And that's what we're seeing. It is entirely the wrong strategy. She's floundered on this for weeks and weeks and weeks. They need a complete rethink on it. Because otherwise, all the time that she rightly argues that she needs won't be given to her, because the party, I don't think, has lost that kind of feverish mentality of saying, this isn't working, let's replace her with somebody else.
Yeah.
And panic.
Thank you for listening to those podcasts. I'm sure there's more that we'll get to in a sec on them as well. One of my immediate thoughts, perhaps, Joe, for you, Kirsty, come in as well, is that a long-form interview for Kemi Badenoch is arguably easier right now when there's no policy to scrutinise. If you do 90 minutes of drilling policy, that's a harder interview than one where you're sort of setting out the philosophy of owning the mistakes, planning for policy, and getting back to authentic conservatism. These are quite broad kind of things. That's fine. It's good to have philosophy. It's good to have a direction. But when there's no policy for somebody to drill at for 90 minutes, is that an easier interview? Joe?
It's a bit fluffy, though, in that there's not a huge amount of substance you can drag out for that long.
Yeah.
Even about, you are just kind of talking about your organisational skills and why you're doing things a certain way, but how long can you really make that sound interesting? And in a way, it's dangerous to do such a long interview when you don't have a lot to sell, really, because you can just potentially bore people unless you're, very focused and it feels like homework and you want to listen to it, of which there is a small number of people. But also the fact is, to Kirsty's point, like, you still have to turn up and show up in the big moments. And the problem is, with Leader of the Opposition, you don't get a lot of big moments. As Leader of the Opposition, if you decide to make a speech, most people will go, who cares? If you're lucky, it will make a snippet on the news. It wouldn't be carried live, probably, unless it was hinted that you were going to resign. Making a speech as Leader of the Opposition is not particularly interesting when you're this far out from an election. So the one time that you do have to get attention is PMQs, because you know it's going to be carried live on certain channels. You know that us and many others will be analysing it. And if you look at what Corbyn did, Corbyn wasn't particularly great at PMQs, but what he did was his sort of, his preamble was the stuff that they were then able to go and clip. And they would, they'd bang that out on Facebook and other places, and it would get people sort of going, yeah, you're talking about stuff I care about. The slight problem with Kemi's team is that they seem to be going on the obvious. And the problem is, if you go on the obvious because it's been in the front page story of a newspaper, they're clearly going to have an answer prepared. So actually going on the obvious is where it's more dangerous, because you know that they'll have workshopped it to within an inch of its life by the time you get into the chamber.
And even more of a nightmare, presumably, as far as she's concerned, is the answer was actually quite clear.
Well,
to
that's the problem. Like,
Keir Starmer.
It almost feels like if this was if this was one of those decision charts where it's like, do I want to invite so-and-so to my wedding? Question, do you like them? Do you not? They go in which bucket or whatever. Like those things where you have a decision tree. Does this person have the right skills? Do you fire them? Do you redeploy them? All those decision tree sort of moments. It doesn't feel like they've had a sort of session where they go, well, what if he comes back and says this?
Yeah.
What do we then do? In the sort of classic preparing any sort of CEO for an interview or a sort of, a board for a shareholder meeting or whatever, you do those scenarios, you scenario plan. That's part of, you don't really need to practice someone standing up and reading out the question. That's not the issue. What you're practicing is, where do I go with what they give me? And so you're effectively sort of, playing tennis against Andy Murray or whoever, and you're sort of working out which way you're going to hit the ball because of what comes at you at what speed and what is the curve on that serve that you're not expecting. And it feels like they're missing that. They're missing the kind of, how do we give her flexibility? Now, is it that she just doesn't have it and she can't do it? And that is a question because of the communication issue is actually partly where she's tied herself up in knots in interviews because she's not known how to handle the questions that have come at her. And that is the skill of PMQs. The skill of PMQs is you're trying to get one over on your opposition. You're trying to find a chink of light to sort of throw something at and see if it sticks. And it feels like she's missing that very basic skill that's needed. And could partly, she might now be having a right row with her team saying, you didn't prepare me properly. They all might be saying, we prepared you fully and you didn't listen. We don't know which one it is.
Yeah. Kirsty?
A number of points flowing off the back of that. One, the podcasts, they weren't fluffy, but it wasn't designed to be an easy ride. It was designed to introduce Kemi as a person to, a potential broad centre-right audience of people who might be thinking, about voting for a centre-right party at some point in the future. Who is she? What motivates her? Why is she adopting this, policy going forward of having no policies for a couple of years or not many? And so from that point of view, fine. My problem with it is it's the wrong time and the wrong audience in terms of who you need to be talking about urgently. What you need to be doing urgently when you have had a catastrophic defeat, you need to love the donors, stop them running away and pulling all the money out of your already denuded party. You need to love the media, and by which I mean the lobby media, because they will create a narrative around you which will work against you with the public. If the media, the lobby, decide you're a dud, that is ultimately what will cut through to the public too. So if you're trying to create a kind of authentic, credible leadership voice, you've got to win over the mainstream media. At some point, by all means, go away and do, podcasts with the right kind of audience. But this is not the point necessarily to do that. And the other thing you need to do is rally the troops and say, look, you voted for me to be a fighter, and and here I go. And what I don't understand, apart from the fact that the way she constructs sentences and questions in PMQs is too long, too full of clauses, too rambling, too easy for Starmer to pick the bit that suits him and bat the rest of it away because he's a lawyer by profession. And by the way, Starmer is not great at PMQs.
No, that was going to say.
She's just making him look better than he is with this, and what like I say, people voted for Kemi the fighter at PMQs. They're getting Kemi the engineer. And these kind of clever questions don't play. And the thing that baffles me the most, of all the things that they could have gone on today, they've gone on, a very, very complicated story about, a high court ruling and a load of very, very complicated stuff that underneath, Starmer is going to come back and say, well, I'll take no lectures from, the party, the government that, let their open borders and had 1.1 million net migration come to this country, et cetera, et cetera. You know where that's going to end up. No matter how you get there, that's where it's going to end up.
Yeah.
This is the same week where you've had a minister being suspended from the Labour Party. You've had another Labour MP also being suspended, and 11 MPs being for really, really, racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, vile text messages. Now, of course, he's going to say this is subject to, an investigation, yada, yada, yada. That's not the point. What you're trying to signal there is, you promise to be, clearer than, purer than pure, a new kind of politics. Look at this. That's what you're trying to say, is look at the people. Look at your judgment. Look at the people that are around you.
I'm amazed they didn't go on anti-Semitism, because you could have said it's alive and well in your party still, and you could have gone straight on that. And I was surprised that they didn't. And at that point, Kirsty, my point about fluff is it's fluffy to be doing the let's learn about Kemi and what she cares about when you've got a country about to hit a recession again and you've got all these dire numbers everywhere. I think I suspect the decision was don't go on the WhatsApp stuff simply because they know they've got their own problems. Because if, it just is a gift to have a bunch of journos suddenly, pull out another WhatsApp thread with a bunch of Tories on it, which probably will be pretty unsavoury as well. So there's always that risk, but it didn't feel like the right subjects to me, for sure.
Honestly, by the time we got to the fifth or sixth question, they were so complicated, Joe. If you put a gun to my head and he said, explain to me what she was asking, I wouldn't have been able to do it. It's not the right way to do PMQs. It's not an exercise. It's not an Oxford debating society. No. It's not an exercise in who can frame the most.
That's where Corbyn was good. That Corbyn's stuff was sort of, it was plain speak. He did the preamble to a question. It was plain speak, and they were clippable. So they just used to stick them out on socials, which were, look at us holding the government to account. Look at where we're showing up where things are going wrong. And that's what those overly complicated questions don't do, because all that will happen is most people will either switch off or will try and figure out what she meant by what she was saying, which that's not the point of clips for socials, right? That's not what it does.
And look, this government came in on two things. It promised to be, have greater integrity than the lot it was replacing and be pure and virtuous. And every time somebody did something terrible in the last government, which was a lot of times, they'd get their, they'd clutch their pearls and say they must resign. And so you'd set your kind of standards bar really high. So that was one thing. So every time you've got, you've now had, you've lost your third minister in 7 months out of issues of integrity. That's not a great look for the party. So you've got that. And they also promised growth, which at the moment you can all source right back to the budget, which was bad for business. So on the one hand, you've got, a government saying grow to business. On the other hand, you've got the government putting its foot on the brake of business, as we've said, many times in this podcast, over the kind of massive tax burden it's landed on business and the greater, burdens it will add in terms of workers' rights, etc. So, if nothing else works for you, go for the two things you can lay at their door, as opposed to them just going, Yahoo sucks, I'll take no lecture from the party that did X, Y, and Z in government. There are things, if nothing else, she should go every single week on issues of growth, business. This week, Kemi started the week, and I do have a lot of sympathy with her with this. It's difficult to get cut through. Most people probably won't know this. When the National Farmers Union did its protest at the start of the week with the tractors again, because there was a debate in Parliament about the inheritance tax charge that the Chancellor's levied on family farms, all you saw in the media was Nigel Farage standing alongside farmers talking at stage. Kemi was on that too. Kemi was on that protest. Kemi made a speech. Kemi was out there standing shoulder to shoulder with farmers. So cut through is really, really difficult. But if you don't get PMQs right, you're right, Joe. It's probably where 90% of people that she needs to win over now will see and interact with her. And she won't get 2 years if, this party that has become so febrile, so panicky, watches her week after week after week being wiped the floor by Starmer, who is not that great at PMQs.
So that's interesting. She won't get 2 years. I mean, all my life, perish the thought. Do you think that is an active conversation within the Conservative Party?
Well, yes and no. Look, I worked in, number 10 in the years of Brexit. If I had £1 for every single time there was a plot, or they were definitely getting up to the 52 letters going into the chairman of the 1922 committee to spark a leadership contest, or I had, nasty MPs sidling up to me and, cutting putting their hand across their throat and saying, not long now, and all this kind of, horrible, all the time. Couldn't walk through Portcullis House without some, opposition, not an opposition MP, someone opposed to our Brexit bill in our own party coming over and saying snide things about the time that she had left, right? So, yes, it happens a lot. So on one level, this is kind of just kind of the zeitgeist of a party that has got high, I think, on the drama of replacing leaders very, very quickly, and is very, very quick to dismiss people because it is not a party united and hasn't been for many, many years. But having said that, I spoke to some people over the last few weeks, and one thing that was really hardened and almost kind of cost her the dressing room was that she went into CCHQ, I think, last week. And I think, bear in mind that CCHQ has lost a lot of people, it has no money, it's struggling. They all feel under the cosh at the moment. She came in for what everyone thought was going to be a pep talk. And she basically told them to pull their fingers out and do better. There is a feeling, I've spoken to a couple of MPs that, both her and the team around her are a little high-handed, considering how little that they have to be high-handed about, that her performance so far isn't good enough. And there are active conversations being had about potential replacements. Now, obviously, every time you look up, there is Rob Jenrick popping up on X, Y and Z programme, reminding people that he's in the mix. I don't think it's any coincidence that, increasingly I see Penny Mordaunt out and about again. So, and I know she's not an MP anymore, but, you can get round this Chiltern Hundreds and all that. And I've even heard talk, and I'm not saying that this is in any way realistic, nor am I saying it's sanctioned by the people involved in it, but trying to unite the party around actually what we were talking about, someone with the grit and someone with the charm. So you have kind of a dream ticket of Cleverly, who has all the charm, who is your kind of prime ministerial, ambassadorial type role, and Priti Patel as sort of deputy, who will have kind of more of the grit and be more of an attack dog.
Wow. Joe, what do you make of all of that, Joe?
Well, it's unsurprising. I think there is a reality that when you take over as the leader after a very big defeat, most people don't expect you're still going to be the leader at the next election. You are very likely to be the one that starts doing the healing or redundancies and, soul searching, and that then somebody else sweeps in and takes over a couple of years out from an election when when the money starts to flow back in and the plotters kind of coalesce around somebody. So I don't think this is a huge surprise. I still have my doubts about whether someone like James would want to sort of fight that election, particularly at the moment with the sort of splintering with reform and where the debate is at. I could see James going more for sort of London mayor and going that route, and then sort of coming back into frontline politics in a sort of different way, and probably in a way that Boris did to some extent. Sometimes people go out and come back. Look at Cameron, out into the wilderness, then came back as Foreign Secretary. There are very interesting sort of comeback routes in different ways to then become the job that you ultimately wanted. But there are definitely plenty of people that are walking around saying we picked the wrong person. Now, the parliamentary party, feel that probably very acutely when they've got to sit behind today's performance. And actually remember, it's that kooky way that the Tories elect people anyway, that it wasn't, it was a failure of the spreadsheets by all accounts that we ended up where we were anyway, because it was all a bit of a cock up with the numbers and who was with who and who was backing who. And it wasn't that the Tories never managed to make this just a straight sort of first past the post system election. Whenever they do their leadership stuff, it's all very sort of trying to be clever to knock people out and different associations with individuals, alliances and stuff that don't necessarily always pan out. So I don't think it's a surprise. And I think it's also just the reality of having a smaller group of people in the House, a group of people that are trying their best with the resources that they've got. It's really Kirsty alluded to it earlier. Opposition is really bloody hard, like especially really hard after you lose. I was working for the Tories in 2001. Now that election was the Prescott punch. It was William Hague. It was where William Hague's own, Michael Portillo's own advisor had actually briefed to a journalist that there was something a bit dodgy about William Hague, who was the leader at the time, and ended up on the front page of like the Mirror. It was the most extraordinary run up to an election. And straight afterwards, you had IDS took over. You had 9/11, and IDS didn't last that long. And you had a party that was really in a bit of a mess. You had a few sort of star performers who went and did clever sort of looking into policy and tried to sort of develop things. But even then, because the really big cheeses from the party were not paying attention, they sort of freaked out. I remember working with Damien Green and going off with the unions and sort of looking at vocational education in other countries, and they all thought he was a real turncoat because he was, he was fraternising with the NUT, but he was trying to understand more about teachers and the teaching unions and what was needed in the profession, because he was like, we might as well look at everything. We've got a bit of time before there's another election. And it was sensible to do. But his own side thought that he was, he was away with the fairies because it was not the thing to be doing. But actually, it's the one time you've got to do some proper thinking. And, that's probably where, ultimately New Labour came from, was that they had probably too much time to do a lot of thinking, but they actually came up with some stuff when they got in. The problem with Labour is now they haven't come in with a lot of stuff. They just said change. And some of the initial stuff they've done has actually, not been in the country's favour, if anything, to its detriment when you look at sort of job losses and growth figures. So, of course, everyone's restless, but that is the time that as an opposition, you should be lining up and being ready to fight. You should have arrows kind of ready on your back to be, and this one and another one. The stats, the official stats are doing it for you. Business is doing it for you with the negative stories. Like you don't even really have to go and search that hard for ammo. And that's the thing that's a bit surprising, is that it feels like they're not making the most of what's under their noses. You could almost at PMQs have just one question a week, which was just dedicated to the bad news coming out about the economy, and almost pick a pillar, pick one of the missions and use your 6 questions to just hammer where they're not getting it right, where they're doing something wrong, and maybe theme it like that, but just sort of focusing on something that's the headline in a newspaper that then can get batted down pretty quickly because it's embarrassing that your own side had actually agreed to some guy, working from home out of the country or whatever. Like it's not easy, but they're making it harder for themselves.
Yeah, and if I have one kind of criticism of the team around her, is ironically it's the same kind of criticism I had about the team around Rishi Sunak, was that, as my late great mother would used to say, they're so sharp they'll cut themselves. These are a group of people who are individually very bright, but have got kind of hooked on their own kind of, cleverness. PMQs doesn't require clever questions. It requires straightforward, one hit, go for it, keep it as simple and as harsh and as sharp as possible. And actually what I feel like I've got is, like I say, is something that's been drafted by a group of people who, cut their teeth on, in the Oxford Debating Society. Well, fabulous, but that's just not how gut politics works.
It might do them a favour, though. This might do them a favour. This might make them reach out to some of the wise old heads that have, been around for PMQs, prep for years. It might make them think about changing strategy. And if anything, to say, okay, she might not have 2 years, but she's got a bit of time to make a couple of mistakes like this. And the team have got time to make a few mistakes and actually learn from them. I think the test as to whether you survive is whether you learn from the mistakes, whether you read the headlines tomorrow and think everyone else is wrong, or whether you read the headlines and go, we've got to do something. And the winning team eventually is the one that goes, do you know what? We didn't get it right. We've got to improve. It's when you think everyone else is wrong that, it's game over, because you'll never, ever improve. You'll just continually think you know how to do it right. And that is not the way it's not the way to lead. It's not the way to govern either, eventually.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And whilst obviously, you've got the febrile crowd of the Conservatives already saying, pushing forward this candidate or that candidate as the successor.
Astonishing.
Which, I mean, this is kind of just what the Conservatives have got hooked on. They're jonesing for it. It's been at least 5 seconds since they
It's been a minute.
last ousted a leader. So, you've got that. But even the more sensible heads within the Conservative Party are saying, look, we're not there yet. We're not in a position where we think that, that this is unrecoverable and that she is a problem. But they're already beginning to see a world where that is an issue. And I don't think, she was talking in both these podcasts about having spoken to previous opposition leaders, and they said, well, you've got kind of 2 years to win back the public and earn a right to be heard by the public. And that might very well be true, but, again, I come to the point that right now, the public is not her problem. It's her parliamentary party, and that's who you need to win. And this, Kemi as an engineer, as opposed to Kemi as a street fighter, is not doing it.
Guys, really, really great conversation on Kemi Badenoch. Your thoughts very welcome. Add to the conversation. We'll pick up on them next week on the pod. You can WhatsApp us. You can email us. The WhatsApp number is 0333 404 6507 and start your message with the word Whitehall, or you can email hello@whitehallsources.com. Now, we've just got a few minutes left, and this is a subject to which we will return in future as a result, but medical experts are warning that amendments to the assisted dying bill could be a slippery slope. Hundreds of changes are being added. The terminally ill adult end-of-life bill has got 300 amendments tabled so far, and more are expected in the coming weeks. Probably the most hotly debated one is the removal of the approval of a High Court judge, which was seen by many politicians as an extra safeguard that would then allow them to vote for the bill. But the amendment to that by the Labour MP Kim Leadbeater, who proposed the bill in the first place, would see that being replaced with an expert panel consisting of a senior legal figure, a psychiatrist and a social worker to give their final approval. Now, there are obviously hundreds of other amendments as well, so I encourage you to read up on what they all are. Joe, this is highlighting people's concerns with this process. For this sort of policy, wherever you stand on it, there are real concerns that the way this legislation is being made, the way this bill is being put forward, isn't adequate for the type of changes that are being discussed.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to express a bit of sympathy for Kim and her team, because it's a tough, I can't imagine what the inbox looks like. I can't imagine how that office is operating under the sort of pressure that they're under. But this is the challenge when you get into a subject that is so contentious and has repeatedly failed over the years because it is so difficult to get this right. And, there is I think, a valid concern about this route to a private member's bill sort of being the route through to deal with this, just because of whether there is not so much the scrutiny, but the support to get it right. And there are, many different interests in this debate that will be lobbying incredibly hard. I don't think this is where, I don't know, I haven't spoken to Kim about it, but it doesn't feel like this is where she wanted it to be, because I think she had wanted this High Court judge involvement. Many of us at the time that it was announced said it sounds great, but it's never going to work, and were shouted down for sort of saying so. But actually the practicalities are the practicalities. So I'm not convinced that, given the state of the social care system, that a social worker is necessarily going to be any easier to get to have in this process than a High Court judge to some extent, because you're just leaning back on a system that's broken anyway. We know the court system doesn't work. Social care really doesn't work. I mean, we've all got experiences and very high profile cases we can quote where it doesn't work. So I have grave concerns that this is a fudge now to try and get to, I think the narrative sounds right. The narrative sounds perfectly plausible. This is a panel. This means there's more scrutiny. This means there's more protection. But the reality is the very people that you're putting in the mix of this are all people that are incredibly busy with their current day jobs. And there isn't the room for them to do this kind of stuff. So I do feel that the criticism of whether this is the right forum, the right route for this kind of life-changing, life-ending, seismic, definitive, you cannot appeal it after it's done legislation. You you can do what you can, but once that life's ended, that life is ended. And if the idea that the process has not been done properly, then gosh, we really do have some problems to be concerned about. So yeah, it does worry me quite a lot, actually.
I think that feeling is becoming the dominant narrative, actually. So yes, there are 300 amendments, but it's just this unease around the process, I think, that actually is seeping into the minds of the public, also MPs. There's talk of MPs changing their votes and saying, well, hang on a second, this isn't what we intended at all, Kirsty. So it's just that creeping feeling that this isn't right.
In 2011, the then Health Secretary, Andrew Lansley, had to come up with a set of reforms for NHS modernisation that ended up being so convoluted and so complicated that you would give yourself a migraine just trying to understand them. And if you will recall, that became so problematic as the bill on that modernisation of the NHS went through the Commons that David Cameron stepped in and said, no, the backlash was becoming so overwhelming from the NHS. He said, no, we're going to pause this bill. We're going to listen to people. We're going to reflect on what they have to say, and we're going to change it. And I think we have got to this position. And I've always argued that regardless of the principles at stake here, something that fundamentally changes the contract between the state and its citizens in this way it should never have been introduced and piloted through in a private member's bill. But it was entirely wrong. And I think it behoves the Prime Minister now to step in and say, look, with the best of intentions, this isn't working. We need to put pause on it. We'll set up a Royal Commission. I mean, this is a government that has set up a commission for social care funding, even though we've had umpteen inquiries and we all know pretty much how social care should be funded, but won't set up a commission on this fundamental change in how our society operates, despite numerous concerns, not just about the principles around coercion, but the very real practicalities of how this is going to work. And when you're getting into a position where it feels like things are being drawn up on a fag packet as the problems arise, this is no way to make any legislation. So if I had one kind of plea now, right, Starmer, step forward, put a pause on this. If you're going to do this, and maybe we will and maybe we won't as a society, but let's do it the right way. And if Starmer doesn't step forward like this, then what is the job of MPs? One of the jobs of MPs is to make good law. No matter what you think about this, no matter where you stand on this debate, this is not good law. It's got to be stopped. We need a rethink.
Although I would argue that 300 amendments, while problematic, it is actually what Parliament does. The point is parliamentarians will wade in and they will try to do their best to make it good legislation. And I think there will be a point where, the votes will happen, people will step in. That's what politicians are there to do. That's what parliamentarians are there to do. And that is where we have to hope that our fantastic and much revered democracy that we often moan about, podcasts like this and other places, look at what we say about politicians and what they do. Look at how we get frustrated with parliamentarians and how Parliament works at times. This is when it has to come into its own, because the very nature of how things are scrutinised and how they can be amended and how they can be debated is exactly where they have to do the right thing.
We've just got a couple of minutes left, so let's just mention a thought each on the WhatsApp messages and indeed on the actions of the Labour Party in response to WhatsApp messages sent by, a now suspended Labour MP that appear to mock Jewish clothing. There's, of course, this growing sense that this could be a real problem with anti-Semitism and on any number of other things, misogyny, homophobia, you name it, these messages have got them in them. Oliver Ryan became the second MP to be suspended on Monday over messages in this WhatsApp group called Trigger Me Timbers. 11 councillors have also been suspended. This is after Health Minister Andrew Gwynn was booted when it was revealed he had taken part in the WhatsApp group as well. Just a thought each. Kirsty, we'll start with you on the kind of, I suppose, the political response to this. Starmer was swift, to give him credit where it's probably due. I just wonder where we're up to in all of this now.
Yes, Starmer was swift. How could you not be once those messages had been exposed? They're utterly appalling, completely unacceptable. I see no way back for for either of those MPs into the parliamentary party once that investigation is over. And very possibly, depending on the sanctions that Parliament might come forward for them, one or both of them might find a recall from their own constituents and might find that they will ultimately lose their seat. And I will, for one, be shedding no tears on this. I will just tell you a story about how important it is to always be aware of what you are doing and the fact that anything you put in writing, can and will come back and bite you if you're not careful. When I was at Number 10, this is a true story, I set up a WhatsApp group for a group of people, and I called this WhatsApp group something. I mean, at best, it was a bit kind of saucy postcard double entendre, right? I mean, no worse than that. And one of the MPs in the group immediately quit. And I rang him up and I said, I'm sorry. I said, have you just quit because you don't like the title of the WhatsApp group? I can change it. Sorry, it was just a little joke. I didn't mean to offend you. And he said, well, can you change it? And I changed it to something about, Amish are us. Because, and then he came back onto it. That's how... Now, you can maybe argue that, was that a bit of an overreaction? But better an overreaction to something like that than to sit there and participate in some of the... I mean, I was shocked by some of the stuff I've heard. And to sit there and participate in, not to challenge it, to egg it on for, years and years and years, this group seems... There's loads and loads of these text messages. I think it's indefensible. Utterly appalling. I mean, yes, fair play to Starmer and the Labour Party for acting quickly on it. How could they not?
Yeah. And Joe?
I don't think they should be MPs.
Yeah.
I have a really strong, on this stuff, I'm sure there's things I've said in a WhatsApp group that are not appropriate or may have offended somebody, or, maybe I've been a bit unkind about someone at some point. I don't believe that I've ever expressed racist or homophobic or I don't, it's just not how I operate. It's just not who I am. But there is a fundamental principle about democracy and the role of local councillors and MPs, that you are there to represent people that voted for you and those that didn't. And that means that there has to be no colour, no judgment, no view about any single person that ever walks into your constituency surgery. You are there to help solve the problems that they've got, and you are there to help it represent their interests, whether you like them, whether they smell, whether they look different to you, whether they're rude. It doesn't matter. Your job, you're a public servant, goddammit. You are there paid by taxpayers that like you and don't like you. Your job, it's a job. And therefore, your job is to represent all of them. And the idea that you would be mocking people and, being vile, quite frankly, about your own colleagues as well. And yeah, sure, they all upset each other at times. But, I just don't understand why you would go into public service of that nature. Go and be a librarian if you want to be a public servant, and you don't have to, you can just tell people to shut up all the time because they're being noisy in a library. You don't have to deal with their issues. But if you're going to be in that role, which is fundamentally about representing everyone, don't do the job. And we shouldn't have people doing that job if that's the way they're going to behave. I sort of feel a bit like I'm on a moral high ground on this stuff. I feel quite angry that there's, I've run a football team 4 years, parliamentary women's football team, with people of all political persuasions, different religions, different race, different sexual orientation. And we are the most interested, warm, affectionate bunch to each other. People that have had, on the other side of the house have had a difficult time, and you've got politicians from the other side whose own side have been attacking them, would send a message of comfort or hope they're all right. We might disagree on stuff, but I hope you're okay, you're a human being. No abuse, I find it just quite astonishing. It's a nasty side, actually, of politics that I think a lot of us that comment on it, a lot of us that have worked in it, sort of try and tell people it's not like that. These are good people generally. They're trying to do the right thing. And then you get people like this who just make a mockery of it all. And I think it's wrong. I hope there is a recall. I really do. I don't think they should be in Parliament. I'm sure they're not enjoying being there now.
No.
And that's a good thing. I hope they get
quite right.
from their colleagues, to be honest.
Exactly. Joe and Kirsty, thank you so much for all your thoughts today. Just to say, in the last few minutes as we've been recording on Wednesday afternoon, a couple of bits of breaking news for you. Harry Cole at The Sun, just on what we've been discussing about Kemi Badenoch, he tweets, shadow cabinet ministers are fairly downbeat after PMQs. One laments something has gone wrong with Badenoch's Commons performances compared to elsewhere. She's surrounded by sycophants is the problem, according to someone else. So I just thought I'd drop that in by way of bookending that conversation. And here's one that we will return to. Stephen Twinford from The Times says the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury appears to confirm that the OBR has downgraded growth forecasts and that Rachel Reeves' £9 billion headroom has been wiped out. Here's the quote, we'll be investigating and following it up as a potential leak. It's important to put a ring round these forecasts and ensure they are not in the public domain. That was after earlier reporting on the issue from Phil Aldrich at Bloomberg. We'll come back to that one for sure. That means you should subscribe and you should follow. We will drop into your podcast feed then. You'll never miss an episode. Thanks to Kirsty, thanks to Jill, and thank you for listening. We'll talk to you again next week.